Imagine a company so powerful, it made Apple, Microsoft, and Amazon look small. 400 years ago, it already existed, and it wasn't ruled by kings or armies. It was ruled by shareholders. When you think about capitalism, wealth creation, and old money, the first names that often come to mind are the Rothschilds or the Rockefellers, dynasties that defined modern wealth. But long before them, there was a quiet little Dutch company that created the entire system they later mastered. They called it the Dutch East India Company, the world's first corporation. At its peak, it was worth $7.9 trillion in today's money, commanding ships, soldiers, and entire nations. It didn't just trade spices, it traded power itself, and when it fell, its system survived. The stock market, the modern corporation, even Wall Street, all of it traces back to this forgotten empire. So how did one small country create the blueprint for global capitalism? Let's go back to the year 1580. The late 1500s was a world defined by empires. Spain and Portugal stood unchallenged, ruling the seas with fleets that stretched from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. Gold from the Americas poured into Madrid, and spices from Asia enriched Lisbon. Europe's wealth flowed south, while northern nations watched in frustration. In this age, power wasn't measured by land alone, but by who could command the oceans. And Spain and Portugal controlled them completely. Every route worth sailing, every spice worth trading, and every port worth docking was marked by their flags. The rest of Europe was forced to buy from them, paying inflated prices for pepper, nutmeg, cinnamon, and silk. These luxuries weren't just commodities, they were symbols of dominance. To dine with spice was to dine with power. And as merchants and nobles across Europe emptied their purses to buy Eastern goods, a silent realization spread. Whoever broke the Iberian monopoly would own the future. But no one had yet found the courage, resources, or unity to challenge it. The Dutch were the unlikeliest of rivals, a small cluster of provinces divided by language, faith, and loyalty. They were considered too fractured to matter in global politics. Yet beneath that surface was a restlessness, a combination of ambition, intelligence, and sheer stubbornness. These weren't kings or conquerors, they were shipbuilders, traders, and thinkers. The Dutch lacked gold mines or vast territories, but they had something more valuable: the world's best navigators and an obsession with precision. In their small shipyards and counting houses, rebellion was slowly transforming into opportunity. Geography played its part too. The Netherlands sat between the wealthy nations of Western Europe and the open North Sea, a perfect hub for trade. Every tide that rolled into their harbors carried rumors of distant riches and untapped markets. Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and Delft began to dream not of conquest, but of commerce, to build a power not through armies, but through trade routes. And as their maps grew more detailed and their ships more reliable, their vision began to feel less like fantasy and more like destiny. But ambition alone wasn't enough. The Dutch were still under the thumb of Spain, ruled by King Philip II, whose empire was both vast and merciless. Heavy taxes, religious persecution, and political control suffocated the provinces. Yet this oppression only deepened their resolve. Out of this turmoil, an idea began to form. If the Dutch couldn't win freedom by force, they'd win it through enterprise. And that idea would soon spark a revolution that changed the course of global history. The Netherlands in the late 16th century was a land without a monarch, not by choice, but by rebellion. The people had grown tired of Spanish rule and the crushing weight of imperial taxes. They fought not to replace one king with another, but to prove they could survive without one. It was a radical idea for the time, a nation built on commerce, faith, and cooperation instead of royal decree. But to survive, they needed more than courage. They needed a system that could outsmart empires. With their armies outnumbered and resources scarce, the Dutch turned to their greatest strength: innovation. They built ships that could travel farther, faster, and carry more cargo than any in Europe. They developed new accounting systems, better navigation tools, and wind-powered mills that transformed their flatlands into industrial hubs. In every sense, the Dutch transformed necessity into invention. Where other nations relied on crowns and colonies, the Dutch relied on intelligence and efficiency. Trade became their weapon, and knowledge their armor. Merchants pooled resources to fund voyages, scientists perfected map-making, and sailors risked their lives to find new routes to Asia. Routes the Iberians swore were impossible. Each success funded the next expedition, and each expedition brought home stories of unimaginable wealth. Bit by bit, a small, defiant nation began to challenge the mightiest powers on Earth, not with swords, but with ships and silver. At the heart of this new order was a belief that people, not kings, could shape destiny. The Dutch provinces worked together through a republic system, allowing merchants and mayors to make decisions once reserved for royalty. It was messy, often chaotic, but remarkably effective. Their unity was rooted not in bloodlines, but in shared profit. And while the rest of Europe fought wars for territory, the Dutch quietly built a global network of trade, information, and influence. By the end of the 1500s, the Netherlands had become something the world had never seen before: a nation ruled by markets, not monarchs. In their independence, they discovered a new form of power: economic sovereignty. What began as rebellion against Spain would evolve into the foundation of modern capitalism. And in the years to come, this small republic would give birth to a company so powerful it would rival entire empires: the Dutch East India Company. By the late 1500s, Europe had developed an addiction, not to gold or silver, but to flavor. Nutmeg, cloves, cinnamon, and pepper were luxuries worth their weight in bullion. A handful of spice could buy an entire ox. A shipload could buy a city. The mystery of where these treasures came from gave the Iberian empires their advantage. Every merchant in Europe dreamed of reaching the Spice Islands, but Portugal's secret routes and Spain's naval patrols made that dream almost impossible. For the Dutch, spices weren't just goods, they were symbols of independence. Breaking Spain's monopoly meant more than profit, it meant survival. Amsterdam's harbors buzzed with whispers of distant islands, where nutmeg trees grew wild and untouched. Maps were redrawn from memory, rumors turned into coordinates, and cartographers worked late by candlelight, tracing imaginary routes to freedom. The risk was suicidal, but the potential reward was enough to make ordinary men gamble everything they owned. The first Dutch expeditions were desperate experiments. Their ships were smaller, their resources limited, and their crews inexperienced compared to the Spanish armadas. But what they lacked in size, they compensated for with precision. Dutch shipbuilders engineered faster hulls and lighter masts. Their navigators studied wind patterns ignored by others. These early voyages often returned battered and half-starved. Yet even a single barrel of cloves sold in Amsterdam could erase every loss. Each success inspired 10 more investors. As the voyages multiplied, a new class of merchant began to emerge. Men who understood that information was power. They bought not only goods, but also maps, routes, and secrets. Trade became espionage. Every expedition was a lesson, every failure, a new blueprint. The Dutch learned the geography of the East one storm, one reef, one death at a time. And with each return, they inched closer to mastering a game once reserved for kings. By the end of the century, Europe's obsession with spice had transformed into something larger, a new vision of commerce. Profit no longer depended on land or loyalty. It depended on knowledge and risk. And at the center of that awakening stood the Dutch, armed with discipline, driven by defiance, and ready to challenge two empires at once. The first Dutch expeditions proved that fortune favored the bold, but they also revealed a problem: competition. Independent merchants kept sabotaging one another, bidding up prices, duplicating routes, and wasting resources. Each city wanted its own glory, each fleet its own profits. To survive against the Spanish and Portuguese monopolies, the Dutch had to unite. For the first time, merchants who were rivals in port agreed to cooperate at sea. In the coastal taverns of Amsterdam and Rotterdam, sea captains, investors, and civic leaders gathered to debate a radical idea: a single trading company that represented all of them. Instead of fighting for fragments, they would share the entire enterprise. Pooling capital meant they could fund larger fleets, hire better crews, and ensure their voyages. What began as a pragmatic solution slowly evolved into a vision: a nation powered not by nobles, but by merchants. The early unified fleets became a symbol of hope. Dutch ships began intercepting Spanish galleons and Portuguese carriers, seizing cargoes of spice and silver. Each successful capture wasn't piracy. It was payback for decades of oppression. Every returning vessel was greeted as a national victory. Its sails torn but triumphant. Its holds filled with wealth that once funded the enemy. For a people under foreign rule, trade itself had become a form of rebellion. These victories electrified Europe. Investors from across the continent flooded Amsterdam with money, eager to share in the profits. Suddenly, a small republic with no king had discovered a weapon more powerful than any army: economic unity. The Dutch realized they could fight empires not by destroying them, but by out-earning them. Commerce became their revolution and capital their sword. But coordination wasn't enough. Dozens of small trading groups still operated with overlapping charters, each demanding priority. Without structure, chaos would return. The Dutch needed a system strong enough to hold every investor, every ship, every ambition under one flag. And in 1602, that system was born. In 1602, the States General of the Netherlands approved a charter that would redefine the modern world. It merged all competing merchant ventures into a single organization, the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, or Dutch East India Company. It was more than a company. It was a government, a bank, and an army combined. It could mint coins, sign treaties, build forts, and wage war, all in the name of profit. No nation had ever granted private citizens such authority before. Investors rushed to buy shares. For the first time in history, ownership of a business could be divided into tradable pieces of paper, stocks. Ordinary people could now invest in voyages they'd never see, across oceans they'd never sail. And when those ships returned, the profits were shared among thousands. Capitalism, as we know it, was born not in a palace, but in a harbor filled with ships. Within months, the VOC sent out fleets larger than any single European kingdom had ever managed. It built warehouses in Amsterdam, fortresses in Asia, and a network of agents who negotiated directly with rulers from India to Indonesia. The Dutch flag began to appear in ports once thought unreachable. The world map, once colored by monarchs, was being redrawn by merchants. The company's success was immediate and staggering. Dividends of 40 to 60% were not uncommon. Investors became national heroes, and Amsterdam became the financial capital of the world. Behind its brick facades and narrow canals, a new kind of empire was forming. One built on contracts instead of conquests. The Dutch had achieved what centuries of war could not: independence through prosperity. But beneath the triumph, something unprecedented was taking shape. A new kind of power that belonged neither to kings nor nations. The VOC was accountable only to its shareholders, and as profits grew, so did its reach, its arrogance, and its appetite. The seeds had been planted, and soon they would grow into the most powerful corporation the world had ever seen. In 1602, a notice appeared in Amsterdam inviting citizens to invest in a new trading venture to Asia. For the first time, anyone, not just nobles or bankers, could buy a share of a company that sailed beyond the horizon. Bakers, ship carpenters, and widows carried their savings to the signing tables. Each slip of paper they received wasn't just ownership, It was belief that trade could outlive kings. In a city built on windmills and waterways, a new kind of current began to move: money itself. The process was simple but revolutionary. Investors paid into a common fund that would finance fleets, and in return, they earned dividends from whatever came back. Suddenly, risk was shared and profit was multiplied. People talked about ships as if they owned them, because now they did. It changed how the Dutch thought about value. Wealth wasn't only in gold or land anymore, it was in imagination and trust. Inside Amsterdam's exchange, the atmosphere was restless. Men argued over prices, as clerks inked names into thick ledgers. News of a successful voyage could send prices soaring before the cargo even reached port. This was capitalism's first heartbeat, speculation born from anticipation. A market had appeared where fortunes could rise or fall on rumor alone. What made it extraordinary wasn't greed, it was participation. The Dutch Republic had turned its citizens into stakeholders of the nation's destiny. Their combined investment funded fleets, fortified ports, and financed independence itself. For the first time in history, a people, not a monarch, owned an empire in motion. Yet beneath the excitement was a quiet unease. No one really controlled this new creation. It had no throne, no conscience, and no limit to its growth. The Dutch East India Company had become more than a business. It was an idea, an invisible force built on confidence and calculation, and once released, it could never be contained again. From the moment the first dividends were paid, the company turned its wealth into movement. Shipyards along the Dutch coast rang day and night with hammer blows. Carpenters shaped timbers for vessels longer, faster, and sturdier than any Europe had seen. When they launched, their hulls glistened with tar and ambition. Each ship carried not just cargo, but thousands of investors' hopes. Tiny pieces of ownership sailing into the unknown. The routes were long and brutal. Ships left the gray waters of the North Sea and vanished for years, rounding the Cape of Good Hope before reaching the rich islands of Indonesia and Ceylon. Many never returned. Those that did came home loaded with nutmeg, pepper, and porcelain. A single voyage could pay back its cost tenfold. In Amsterdam, the smell of spice became the scent of victory. The company soon built permanent ports across Asia: Batavia, Malacca, and Cochin, each governed by Dutch officials who answered not to kings but to accountants back home. Ledgers replaced royal decrees. Ships became the borders of a new kind of empire. The VOC didn't need to conquer nations. It conquered markets, one harbor at a time. Every returning fleet turned Amsterdam into theater. Crowds gathered as cranes unloaded chests of goods. Children climbed barrels to watch sailors toss coins into the street. It wasn't war that brought pride to the Republic now, it was trade. Each shipment strengthened both the balance sheets and the belief that commerce could build a country. But success came with cost. To feed its dominance, the company began using the same tools as monarchs: armies, cannons, and coercion. Trade blurred into control, diplomacy into demand. The same ships that brought home fortune also carried the seeds of exploitation. The Dutch had proven that money could move mountains, but they had yet to learn what it could destroy. In the 17th century, power began to shift from thrones to trading houses. Where monarchs once sent armies to conquer, Dutch shareholders now sent fleets. Each voyage was both an expedition and an invasion, financed not by royal decree, but by public capital. It was warfare through accounting, strategic, disciplined, and ruthlessly efficient. The VOC didn't need to wave banners. Its sails were enough to announce its presence. And in many ways, they carried more authority than any crown. Every ship became a floating embassy, armed not only with cannons, but with contracts. Company captains negotiated directly with local rulers, offering trade deals backed by wealth that rivaled entire nations. When persuasion failed, profit justified violence. Battles weren't fought over land, they were fought over supply chains. Spice routes, ports, and islands became the new battlefields of the financial age. The Dutch Republic's wealth didn't depend on armies, it was the army. This transformation changed what it meant to rule. Power could now be projected without borders, controlled from a ledger room instead of a palace. Investors in Amsterdam could decide the fate of distant territories they would never see. The old empires ruled through fear. The Dutch ruled through finance. Money had become not just a means of exchange. It was a weapon, invisible yet unstoppable. The concept spread quickly. European monarchs, watching the VOC's success, began copying its methods. Companies were chartered not to serve citizens, but to expand wealth through speculation. Private capital began funding colonization, and soon the line between business and government disappeared. The VOC had proven that a corporation could be as mighty as any kingdom, and perhaps even more enduring. But that new kind of might carried a moral cost. The further its reach extended, the easier it became to separate profit from humanity. Behind the gleam of gold and spice was exploitation, forced labor, and conquest masked as commerce. The Dutch had discovered how to turn money into power, but power, once monetized, would never remain pure. As ships poured wealth into Dutch harbors, Amsterdam transformed from a port city into the financial heart of the world. Along the canals, merchant houses doubled as offices, and counting rooms hummed with the rhythm of global trade. Money no longer slept. The constant motion of investment, dividends, and reinvestment gave rise to something entirely new, a living financial system that powered an empire without borders. To manage the flow, the Dutch founded the world's first true stock exchange. Under a roof of wooden beams and oil lamps, traders met daily to buy and sell VOC shares. News traveled faster than ships. A rumor about weather off the coast of Java could raise or crash fortunes overnight. It was chaotic, yet somehow orderly, a self-regulating organism that mirrored the company's structure. The exchange became the pulse of capitalism, beating at the heart of the Republic. Soon, another institution was born to stabilize it all, the Bank of Amsterdam. Established in 1609, it acted as the world's first central bank, guaranteeing deposits, issuing credit, and standardizing currency. It gave the Dutch economy a level of trust unseen in Europe. Merchants from London to Venice began keeping accounts there. For the first time, an entire nation's wealth could circulate through paper and promise rather than coin and conquest. This system allowed the Dutch to outcompete far larger empires. Their financial precision replaced the brute strength of monarchies. Amsterdam became a city where mathematics met ambition, where clerks replaced knights and contracts replaced conquests. Every ship that sailed carried not only spices and silver, but also the credibility of Dutch banking behind it. Trade had become a science, and the Dutch were its masters. But with every loan and ledger, the city's identity shifted. What had begun as rebellion against Spanish rule had become a global empire of credit. The streets, once filled with shipbuilders and craftsmen, now belonged to bankers and brokers. Amsterdam no longer built ships, it built systems. And those systems would outlive every empire that tried to destroy them. By the mid-1600s, the Dutch East India Company ruled territories that stretched across oceans. It commanded armies, minted its own currency, and administered justice in lands thousands of miles from Europe. Governors in Batavia and Ceylon carried company seals instead of royal crests. Local populations paid taxes not to a nation, but to a corporation. The VOC had become what no one thought possible: a state without a king, an empire without a crown. In its Asian strongholds, the company acted as both merchant and monarch. It built fortresses, ran courts, and enforced its own laws. Company soldiers defended plantations, while accountants recorded every grain of spice exported. Its rule was efficient but impersonal, governed by balance sheets rather than human needs. Profit dictated policy, and loss justified brutality. To the locals, it was clear, this was not trade, but occupation in disguise. The Dutch Republic back home celebrated its success. Wealth flooded Amsterdam, funding art, architecture, and science. The age of Rembrandt and Vermeer was paid for with the profits of distant lands. The citizens saw prosperity, but rarely questioned its source. The VOC became a symbol of national pride, the proof that a small republic could stand among giants. Yet beneath the celebration lay the quiet truth that this empire had no conscience, only shareholders. Even European monarchs, accustomed to divine power, looked at the company with envy and fear. The VOC operated beyond borders and beyond accountability. It could fund wars, depose rulers, or buy governments. It wasn't a kingdom, it was an algorithm for control, centuries before the word existed. Its genius lay in its design, self-sustaining, profit-driven, and nearly impossible to dismantle. By the time the world realized what it had become, it was too late. The VOC had rewritten the definition of empire. It had proven that wealth could rule without crowns, that nations could be governed by profit, and that markets could conquer where armies failed. The age of kings was ending. The age of corporations had begun. By the mid-1600s, the Dutch East India Company had become an empire without equal. Its reach stretched from the coasts of India to the islands of Japan, from the tip of Africa to the harbors of China. Hundreds of ships moved along its routes like veins in a global body, carrying spices, silver, porcelain, and textiles. Long before anyone spoke the word globalization, the VOC had built the world's first connected economy. To trade with the Dutch was to trade with the world itself. The company's power came not only from ships, but from precision. Every voyage was charted, timed, and accounted for, down to the last coin. Fortresses guarded harbors. Governors enforced monopolies with both contracts and cannons. In Indonesia, local rulers were pressured, or forced, to sell exclusively to the company. In Japan, Dutch merchants negotiated trade privileges that no other Europeans were allowed. From their headquarters in Batavia, the VOC dictated prices, controlled supply, and managed the flow of goods as if pulling strings across continents. The scale was astonishing. At its height, the company employed over 1 million people: sailors, soldiers, clerks, and traders. Its warehouses in Amsterdam and Batavia overflowed with the riches of Asia. Auctions of cloves, nutmeg, and pepper drew crowds so large that streets had to be cleared by guards. Prices across Europe rose and fell according to VOC decisions. The company had become not just a participant in global trade, but the force that set its rhythm. Yet success had its shadows. The VOC's monopoly meant that entire regions were locked into dependence. Farmers in the Spice Islands could grow only what the company demanded, and competition was eliminated through violence or intimidation. Villages were burned, contracts rewritten at gunpoint, and thousands of laborers worked under brutal conditions. Behind the polished ledgers of Amsterdam lay a darker balance sheet, one written in blood and exhaustion. Still, in the eyes of Europe, the company seemed unstoppable. Dutch ships ruled every sea lane, and their efficiency became legend. To other nations, the VOC was both a marvel and a warning, proof that commerce could rival conquest. The seas belonged not to empires, but to those who mastered trade. And in that century, no one did it better than the Dutch. As the VOC reached its peak, another force within the Netherlands began to recognize its influence: the Royal House of Orange. The family had long been the political and symbolic heart of the Dutch Republic, guiding it through wars and revolts. But by the mid-1600s, even royalty could see that power was no longer defined by armies or bloodlines. It was defined by capital, and the company had more of it than any crown in Europe. The Oranges understood that the VOC was more than a business. It was the economic engine of the Republic. To maintain stability and to secure their own influence, they aligned themselves with it. Members of the family invested heavily in company shares, married into merchant dynasties, and placed trusted allies within the company's leadership. In return, the VOC supported royal ambitions abroad, financing military campaigns and political alliances that expanded Dutch influence across Europe. This partnership blurred the line between monarchy and market. When Prince William II and later William III rose to power, their family's fortune was intertwined with VOC profits. When William III became King of England in 1689, he carried with him not just the prestige of royalty, but the financial strategies of the Dutch Republic. Under his reign, London adopted the Dutch model: public debt, joint stock companies, and centralized banking. The seeds planted in Amsterdam now took root across the Channel. The relationship also strengthened the company's political immunity. With the royal family as an unofficial partner, the VOC operated with near-sovereign freedom. Criticism at home was muted. Oversight weakened. Its ships could wage war, its governors could sign treaties, and its directors could make decisions that affected nations, all without direct government control. For a time, the House of Orange and the VOC stood as twin pillars of Dutch dominance. One ruling the land, the other ruling the seas. But such unity came at a cost. The company's growing arrogance mirrored that of the rulers who protected it. As profits peaked, corruption spread quietly through its ranks. Officials grew wealthy off private deals, and shareholders turned a blind eye. The House of Orange had tied its legacy to a power it could no longer fully manage. The same partnership that built a golden age would, in time, help unravel it. By the late 1600s, Europe was a chessboard of uneasy alliances, and the Netherlands had become its quiet mastermind. Amid the chaos of religious wars and shifting empires, one figure emerged from the Dutch Republic who would change the balance of power: Prince William of Orange. Born into a family that had defended Dutch independence for generations, William grew up in a nation that prized commerce over conquest. To him, wealth and diplomacy were the tools of modern rule. In 1688, William seized an opportunity that would make him one of Europe's most influential monarchs. Invited by English nobles to challenge King James II, William led an invasion fleet across the North Sea, one of the largest armadas in European history. But unlike past conquests, this invasion wasn't fueled by religion or revenge. It was funded by merchants, bankers, and investors. The very machinery of Dutch capitalism carried him to power. When William and his wife Mary were crowned joint monarchs of England, the world witnessed a new kind of ruler, one who governed through markets as much as monarchy. His reign introduced Dutch financial discipline to a kingdom long burdened by debt and inefficiency. He surrounded himself with Dutch advisors, bringing with them the principles that had made Amsterdam the financial capital of the world: transparency, accountability, and the art of leveraging credit for expansion. Under William, England's focus shifted from absolute monarchy to a partnership between government and finance. The crown learned to borrow from the people, repay with interest, and fund ambitions through bonds rather than taxes. This concept, tested and perfected in the Netherlands, gave rise to a powerful new model of governance, one where national growth depended on public investment and trust. England would soon master it, and the world would follow. William III's rise symbolized more than a political victory. It marked the cultural triumph of Dutch capitalism. Through one man's ascent, the Dutch financial blueprint crossed borders and planted itself in London's soil. In time, the city would eclipse even Amsterdam, but it would do so using the Dutch design. The world's financial capital had simply changed its address. The influence of Dutch finance on England was immediate. By the 1690s, the new monarchy faced the same challenge that had once confronted the Dutch Republic: how to fund expansion without bankrupting the crown. The solution came straight from Amsterdam's playbook: turn credit into power. In 1694, English merchants and financiers, inspired by the Dutch model, founded the Bank of England. Its mission was revolutionary: raise money for war and trade by borrowing directly from the public. For the first time, a national bank guaranteed the crown's debt, transforming the concept of government borrowing. Instead of relying on unpredictable taxes or foreign loans, the state could now issue bonds backed by public confidence. Investors lent money to the government in exchange for interest, and in doing so, they became partners in empire building. The same logic that had created the VOC, shared risk and shared reward, was now funding the British state itself. The bank quickly became the foundation of England's new financial identity. Its stability attracted capital from across Europe. Merchants, bankers, and even small investors saw government bonds as safer than any private venture. Within a generation, England had built a financial infrastructure capable of sustaining global trade and war simultaneously. Credit replaced conquest as the measure of national strength. The parallels with Amsterdam were unmistakable. England's stock market, insurance houses, and trading companies all borrowed directly from Dutch systems. The financial instruments that once made the VOC powerful were now building a British empire. The Dutch may have invented the model, but the English industrialized it, scaling it to reach every corner of the world. In just a few decades, the Bank of England became more than an institution. It was the new heart of Western capitalism. The flow of capital, once centered in the canals of Amsterdam, now pulsed through the streets of London. The VOC had sown the seeds. England had harvested them. The age of modern finance had truly begun. While England and France chased colonies and armies, the Dutch Republic built an empire without needing one. Its strength didn't lie in the number of soldiers it fielded or flags it planted, but in the invisible threads of commerce that bound nations together. Through credit, shipping, and markets, the Dutch quietly controlled world trade. Their ports were small, but their reach was infinite. Every transaction in Europe, Asia, or the Americas seemed to pass, directly or indirectly, through Dutch hands. The VOC's ships continued to dominate the sea routes, but their power now rested as much in finance as in force. Dutch banks loaned money to foreign monarchs. Dutch merchants insured ships from rival nations, and Dutch brokers set prices for goods they never touched. Influence flowed through numbers, not navies. In an era obsessed with conquest, the Netherlands proved that true empire could exist without borders. Amsterdam became the epicenter of this invisible dominion. Its stock exchange buzzed with global speculation. Its warehouses overflowed with the products of half the earth. Dutch financiers funded wars between other nations and traded with both sides. Neutrality became profit. They were the silent referees of European power, their neutrality masking control. The small republic had become the world's banker, creditor, and supplier all at once. This empire was held together not by loyalty, but by contracts. Agreements signed in Amsterdam determined the fate of kingdoms an ocean away. The Dutch system turned trust into wealth, and wealth into leverage. Their economy didn't need soldiers, it needed signatures. And every signature reinforced their quiet supremacy. But even as they thrived, the Dutch understood that such dominance was fragile. Their success depended on balance. Too much greed could collapse the system they'd built. The 17th century would end as their golden age, a century when a nation smaller than most kingdoms had ruled the world through the sheer power of finance, trade, and intellect. The Dutch had proven that control didn't require conquest, only the wisdom to make others depend on you. By the early 1700s, the Dutch East India Company stood at the height of its power. Its ships ruled the seas, its warehouses overflowed with wealth, and its shareholders lived in comfort that seemed limitless. But beneath the glittering surface of prosperity lay a darker story, one written not in ledgers, but in blood. Behind the polite commerce of Amsterdam's trading houses, company officials in Asia enforced their monopolies with an iron hand. Every shipment of spice carried with it the cost of human suffering that Europe chose not to see. In the islands of Indonesia, the VOC's authority was absolute. Local rulers signed contracts they could not refuse, while farmers were forced to grow only the crops the company demanded. If a village failed to meet its quota, soldiers arrived, not to negotiate, but to punish. Men were whipped, fields were burned, and entire communities were left starving. The company's governors ruled like kings, answerable not to the Dutch Republic, but to investors expecting profits. For them, humanity was an expense line that could be erased. The same system that had built the world's first global corporation also bred its cruelties. The VOC's success depended on controlling supply, and control required fear. From the Indian coast to the Spice Islands, local resistance was met with swift and brutal suppression. Treaties were signed under threat, rebellions crushed before they could spread. For every ship that arrived in Amsterdam laden with riches, hundreds of laborers had suffered to fill its hold. Yet in Europe, this suffering was invisible, hidden behind the language of trade and efficiency. Reports of atrocities occasionally reached home, but they were buried under profits. Directors justified violence as necessary protection of assets. The Dutch Republic, proud of its freedom and tolerance, looked away. To challenge the company meant to threaten national prosperity, and so the brutality continued, disguised by distance and sanitized by bureaucracy. The VOC had discovered that moral accountability could be outsourced as easily as labor. By mid-century, the contrast was impossible to ignore. In the East, the company ruled through fear. In the West, it was celebrated as the engine of civilization. The same system that had once symbolized innovation now revealed its rot. The VOC had built an empire of paper, but its foundations were soaked in exploitation. Its success was both its triumph and its curse. Among the many chapters of the VOC's history, few expose its brutality more than the events on the islands of Ambon and Banda. These tiny specks in the Indonesian archipelago were home to the world's only source of nutmeg and cloves, spices worth their weight in gold. To control them meant to control global trade itself, and when the islanders resisted Dutch demands, the company's response was merciless. In 1623 on Ambon and later on Banda, violence turned paradise into a graveyard, a warning to all who dared defy monopoly. On Ambon, the company accused a group of English traders and local workers of conspiring against its rule. The evidence was thin, but the outcome was predetermined. After brutal interrogations and torture, the accused were executed, beheaded, or broken on the wheel. The massacre sent shockwaves through Europe, but the VOC defended its actions as justice. To them, Ambon wasn't about guilt or innocence. It was about control. The message was simple. Defiance would be met with annihilation. The Banda Islands suffered an even darker fate. When local leaders refused to sell their nutmeg exclusively to the Dutch, the VOC unleashed a campaign of extermination. Entire villages were burned, and tens of thousands were killed or enslaved. The survivors were replaced with imported laborers and loyal colonists, ensuring the company's monopoly for generations. Banda became a factory island, profitable, efficient, and silent. Its soil produced wealth for Amsterdam, while its people vanished from history. Back in Europe, these atrocities were framed as distant necessities. Unfortunate, but unavoidable. The company's propaganda described them as victories that secured trade routes and national prestige. Shareholders received record dividends. Pain translated neatly into percentage returns. The few who protested were silenced or ignored. The VOC had perfected a system where morality was optional and profit perpetual. Centuries later, historians would call these massacres one of the earliest examples of corporate violence on a global scale. But in the 1700s, they were simply business. The Dutch had proven that capitalism could conquer as brutally as any army, and the world had quietly learned from them. The Ambon and Banda massacres were not isolated crimes. They were the blueprint of empire through economics. What began as commerce had now become colonization. By the early 18th century, the Dutch East India Company was drowning in its own success. Decades of unrivaled profit had turned its servants into sovereigns. Governors in Asia lived like kings, surrounded by palaces, courtiers, and private guards. They wore silk instead of uniforms and feasted on imported wines, while their subordinates enforced labor quotas with whips. The VOC had begun as a triumph of discipline and innovation. Now it was consumed by greed. The company's directors, known as the Heren 17, met in Amsterdam to review endless reports of wealth, rarely questioning how it was earned. Corruption was an open secret. Officials inflated expenses, falsified cargo manifests, and diverted shipments for personal gain. Many retired to Holland with fortunes larger than the company's own reserves. Every layer of bureaucracy, from ship captains to governors, found a way to siphon off profit. Accountability vanished as fast as ships leaving the harbor. For ordinary sailors and clerks, life was far harsher. They were trapped in contracts that barely covered their debts, often dying before ever seeing home again. Disease, hunger, and shipwreck claimed thousands each decade, yet the company calculated those losses as the cost of doing business. The human toll never appeared on the balance sheet. To shareholders, the system seemed perfect. Efficiency without empathy, expansion without end. Inside the empire, corruption replaced loyalty. Governors built personal alliances with local rulers, trading influence for gold. They used company soldiers for private gain, seized property, and smuggled goods on rival ships. Oversight from Amsterdam was too distant to matter. The VOC had become a confederation of self-serving fiefdoms, each exploiting the system that once promised unity. By 1750, the empire's brilliance had dulled. The company that had once revolutionized commerce was now bleeding from within. Ships still left port under bright flags, but their hulls carried the rot of dishonor. The VOC's greatest achievement, creating wealth without kings, had become its greatest flaw. In chasing riches without restraint, it had corrupted the very ideals that once made it great. While corruption spread across the seas, power politics deepened its roots at home. The Royal House of Orange, long intertwined with the company, saw in the VOC not just a business empire, but a political engine. Royal allies invested in the company's shares, using its wealth to finance wars, diplomacy, and influence across Europe. The fortunes made in Asia flowed directly into European palaces, funding both stability and ambition. The Dutch Republic prided itself on being a nation of merchants, yet its most powerful family quietly used commerce to secure royal legitimacy. Members of the House of Orange arranged marriages with wealthy merchant families, binding noble blood with corporate wealth. These alliances blurred the line between state and business, turning the VOC into an unofficial branch of royal finance. Even political rivals found it difficult to challenge a company so deeply entangled with the monarchy's interests. As European wars raged, from the War of Spanish Succession to conflicts over colonial territory, VOC profits became a hidden weapon. Ships returning from Asia funded the Dutch military, paid off national debts, and strengthened alliances with England. In some ways, the VOC became the Republic's treasury, its income more reliable than taxation. Yet this dependence only made reform impossible. To criticize the company was to threaten national power itself. The royal family's involvement also fueled arrogance within the company. VOC directors began to act like nobility, adopting titles and privileges once reserved for monarchs. Their decisions carried political weight. Their mismanagement carried no consequence. Even when scandals reached public attention, royal protection ensured silence. The company had become untouchable, shielded by the very power it helped create. By the mid-18th century, the partnership between Crown and corporation was complete. The House of Orange had turned commerce into monarchy, and the VOC had turned monarchy into commerce. Together, they forged a system where money justified rule, and rule justified greed. What began as a financial alliance now stood as proof that corruption thrives best when wealth and power shake hands. In the Dutch Republic, life had never seemed better. The canals of Amsterdam glittered with wealth, art, and culture. Painters like Rembrandt and Vermeer had long immortalized the beauty of a society that saw itself as the beacon of progress. Citizens dined on imported sugar and coffee, wore fabrics from India, and sprinkled cinnamon over desserts from Java. The empire's bounty was everywhere, yet few asked where it came from. The VOC's success had become a source of national pride. Its ships were celebrated in parades, and its captains treated as heroes. Newspapers praised the company as proof of Dutch ingenuity, a testament to how a small nation could rule through intelligence rather than force. By the mid-18th century, the Dutch East India Company was no longer alone at sea. The same business model that had once made it untouchable was now being copied and perfected by rivals. The British and French had learned from the Dutch playbook, merging state power with private investment to build their own trading empires. The British East India Company, especially, emerged as a formidable challenger, backed by the world's strongest navy and a hunger to dominate Asia. The monopoly the VOC once enjoyed had begun to crack. The British were aggressive, organized, and unrelenting. They expanded their control across India, capturing ports, forging alliances, and establishing vast territories where trade and government blended into one. Unlike the Dutch, who ruled from distant Batavia, the British embedded themselves within local power structures. They learned languages, built infrastructure, and turned commerce into colonization. It was a new kind of imperialism, one the Dutch couldn't easily match. Meanwhile, the French East India Company fought for influence in the same waters, its ships competing for spice routes and markets once considered Dutch property. Every nation wanted a share of the Eastern trade, and the VOC's hold weakened with each passing year. The oceans that once carried its fortunes now carried competitors. Trade routes became battlegrounds not just for spices, but for global dominance. The Dutch found themselves trapped in their own legacy. They had taught the world how to turn capital into empire, and now their students were outperforming them. Britain's naval strength and France's ambition reduced the VOC's dominance from empire to endurance. The company could still trade, but no longer dictate the terms. Its power had shifted from commanding the seas to merely surviving on them. For the first time in over a century, the company's supremacy was no longer guaranteed. What had once been a daring invention, a fusion of money, might, and monopoly, was now an outdated machine surrounded by younger, faster rivals. The age of Dutch dominance was giving way to a new order, where the rules of commerce belonged to others. The empire built by merchants had met its match in empires built by nations. As competition intensified abroad, corruption and mismanagement hollowed the company from within. The VOC's network had grown too vast to govern efficiently. Decisions made in Amsterdam took months to reach Asia, and reports from Batavia returned home far too late to matter. In that distance, accountability disappeared. Officials in the colonies ran their territories like personal kingdoms, manipulating trade records and hoarding profits. By the 1750s, the company's books were a labyrinth of lies. Expenses ballooned. Ships cost more to build, armies more to maintain, and the bribes required to keep trade flowing grew larger every year. Investors who had once celebrated record dividends now faced shrinking returns. The same stock that had once been the pride of the Dutch Republic began to lose value. Shareholders grew restless, demanding explanations from directors who could no longer hide the rot. The deeper problem was structural. The VOC had been designed for expansion, not sustainability. It could conquer markets, but not adapt to them. The world it had once shaped was evolving faster than it could manage. Britain's industrial rise, France's colonial ambitions, and new trading routes through the Atlantic reduced Asia's monopoly value. The VOC's dominance had become a burden it could no longer carry. By the late 18th century, debt overshadowed everything. The company owed millions to investors, suppliers, and the Dutch state. Its profits vanished into interest payments, and its reputation sank as fast as its balance sheet. What had once been the symbol of modern capitalism was now its cautionary tale. The VOC had built the world's first corporate empire, and it was dying the same way it had lived, through numbers. As the VOC weakened financially, its grip on the colonies began to loosen. The company's arrogance and exploitation had long bred resentment among the people it ruled, and by the 1770s, that resentment was turning into resistance. Across Indonesia, Ceylon, and India, local leaders began to challenge Dutch authority. Villages refused to meet spice quotas, and workers fled the plantations that had enslaved generations. The system built on fear was cracking from within. In places like Java, uprisings erupted with growing frequency. Local militias attacked VOC outposts, targeting warehouses and tax collectors. The company's military, stretched thin and underfunded, struggled to respond. Many soldiers were mercenaries, more loyal to their pay than their employers, and desertion became common. The company that once commanded armies now begged for reinforcements. These revolts weren't just political, they were economic rebellions against a system that had stripped entire regions of autonomy. For decades, the VOC had controlled what people could grow, buy, or sell. When that control faltered, suppressed markets came rushing back. Illegal trade flourished, undermining the company's profits. Even European merchants began smuggling goods through rival networks, bypassing VOC monopolies entirely. Back in the Netherlands, news of the uprisings was met with denial. Officials downplayed the unrest as isolated incidents, unwilling to admit the empire was slipping away. But investors saw the truth reflected in the numbers: shipments delayed, losses mounting, dividends shrinking. Each rebellion cost more to suppress, and every suppression deepened the hatred that caused it. The VOC was trapped in a cycle of violence it could no longer afford. By the 1780s, the company's colonies were no longer symbols of power, but sources of instability. The empire that had once united continents now fought desperately to hold them together. The Dutch East India Company was learning, too late, that fear could build obedience, but never loyalty. And once that fear was gone, its empire began to fade like a tide receding from the shore. While the VOC battled resistance abroad, Europe itself was changing beyond recognition. The 18th century was an age of revolution and war, and the Dutch Republic was caught in the middle. The rise of Britain as a maritime superpower and the ongoing wars with France drained Dutch resources. The once proud republic that had financed Europe's economy was now struggling to finance itself. The same system that had built its wealth, public credit and investment, was collapsing under national debt. The Royal House of Orange, still tied to the company, faced growing unrest at home. Citizens accused the monarchy of corruption and complacency, blaming them for economic decline. Meanwhile, revolutionary ideas from France spread rapidly across Europe, calling for equality, liberty, and the end of aristocratic privilege. For the Dutch elite, who had grown rich from colonial profits, these ideas were both dangerous and irresistible. The very principles the Republic had once symbolized were turning against it. The VOC's decline mirrored the nation's. As political divisions deepened, the company lost government support and protection. Rival factions debated whether to reform it, nationalize it, or let it die. No decision could be made in time. Wars disrupted trade, British blockades cut off supply routes, and piracy returned to waters once patrolled by Dutch fleets. For the first time, Amsterdam's docks stood quiet. Amid the chaos, the company's global operations became impossible to maintain. Its communications broke down, its leadership fractured, and its colonies slipped into disarray. Even the loyal merchants of Amsterdam, once its greatest defenders, began to distance themselves from the company's name. The VOC, once synonymous with power and prestige, had become a symbol of excess and failure. By the closing decades of the 1700s, both the company and the republic that created it were crumbling. The Dutch, who had once rewritten the rules of commerce, now faced the consequences of their creation. The market they had invented was devouring them, and the world they had dominated was moving on without them. By the end of the century, the Dutch East India Company was finished. Its ships were in ruins, its treasuries empty, and its shareholders disillusioned. The government could no longer ignore the crisis. In 1799, after nearly 200 years of operation, the Dutch Republic formally dissolved the VOC. Its assets, debts, and colonies were absorbed by the state. What had begun as the world's first corporation ended as the world's first corporate bankruptcy. The fall shocked Europe. The company that had once financed nations, toppled rulers, and shaped capitalism itself had collapsed under its own weight. It was a warning the world barely noticed, that no system, no matter how powerful, could survive when greed outweighed governance. The idea of a corporate empire did not die with the Dutch. It simply changed hands. By 1800, the world the VOC had built, of trade, speculation, and global finance, was unstoppable. Its body was gone, but its spirit lived on in every bank, stock exchange, and corporation that followed. The Dutch East India Company had fallen, but the age it created had only just begun. The VOC didn't disappear. It dissolved into the bloodstream of modern civilization. The company's ships may have sunk, but its system survived. Its greatest invention wasn't maritime, it was structural. The concepts of stocks, dividends, limited liability, and joint investment outlived the empire that created them. Even without fleets, the Netherlands remained a nation of bankers and financiers. Across the 19th century, other nations picked up the blueprint. London became the first great imitator. The British Empire adopted the Dutch method of funding global trade through public investment. The London Stock Exchange thrived on VOC-inspired mechanisms. What the Netherlands had invented, Britain industrialized. Factories replaced forts, steel replaced sails. The empire of trade had become the empire of industry. Across the Atlantic, a younger power was learning fast. America, still defining itself, embraced the Dutch model with unmatched enthusiasm. Wall Street became the new Amsterdam, a place where speculation, ambition, and innovation fused into national identity. The Netherlands, though small, remained at the center of a web of companies that carried forward the same spirit of enterprise. Shell, Unilever, ING Bank, and Philips all shared the same ancestral logic: expand globally, manage risk collectively, and let the system, not the state, do the governing. Meanwhile, the United States and Britain carried the Dutch philosophy into the modern financial order. Stock exchanges became symbols of democracy and progress. The idea that ordinary citizens could own parts of vast corporations became a global ideal. Wall Street was the logical endpoint of a journey that began in 1602, the dream that anyone could profit from global enterprise. Every stock ticker, every shareholder meeting, every multinational merger carries the faint imprint of a Dutch ledger written centuries ago. The Dutch East India Company was not just a company. It was a prototype for the modern world. An empire without borders, ruled not by kings, but by capital. And in that sense, it never truly ended. Its ships may be gone, but its shadow still sails above us all.